Professor Vishnushastri Chiplunkar is a professor at Department of History, Dr. Ambedkar University. He has teaching and research interest in the history of anti-caste movement, intellectuals and social history of modern Maharashtra, caste economy and history of caste gender consciousness. He has a renowned book on his name in Marathi, Maharashtraतील प्रबोधन आणि वर्गजाती प्रभुत्व, reform movement of Maharashtra and caste-class hegemony. He has written various booklets and has many articles in renowned journals. And Professor Phule is a founder member of Practicing Anapati Academy, and he is associated with the anti-caste movement from his when he was studying. That time he established Satyashuddha Vidyarthi Sangatna, Chetna group. From 88 he is associated with anti-caste movement. I request to Professor Mahadeo, please give your project.
Thanks, Sangeeta. Thanks, Dina. And women research. This argument is quite old. This was a certain situation in around 1995. Saudi wrote a book called Worshipping Mahatma. So we all, those concerned people, were working together as practicing Anapati academies. And we thought that the kind of reactions are coming to the argument of Saudi is missing the point that everybody was arguing that how Ambedkar was nationalist. The paradigm within which nationalism is seen and argued was Brahminical one. So in certain way, people are placing Ambedkar in a perspective of Brahminical nationalism as he was also a nationalist. So we thought of articulating a different kind of trajectory that we would be going for Ambedkar's and Phule's understanding of alternative nationalism. So at that time we have conceived 4 booklets. We were conceiving 4 booklets. One booklet which I have authored was Phule Ambedkar's nationalism. So it was exercise of understanding Ambedkar and Phule, how they understood hegemonic nationalism. What was their response to the hegemonic nationalism? You all know, you are well aware that there was a debate which took place at JNU on nationalism. Many scholars have theorized nationalism. Anderson, in India, you might be knowing about Parth Chatterjee, you are knowing about Sudipta Kaviraj. You know several kinds of conception of nationalism. I am not picking all kind of definitions here. I pick a workable definition of nation and nationalism, where we presume that there is a unity, oneness. The idea of oneness grounds nation. And on what basis nation emerge has a certain kind of commonalities, common culture, common history, common kind of interest, social, economic, political interest, common kind of, we can say, thinking way, common kind of practices. All this community is understood to be foregrounding kind of principle of what we understand as nation. So this is what exactly a workable kind of understanding of nation and nationality. So the feeling of attachment to this idea of oneness, the emotions escalated on the basis of oneness as we understand as nationalism. That is for workable definitions of nation and nationalism. How it emerged. The stance is very clear. You might have read Rumila Thapar's work. Rumila Thapar has argued that prior to British rule, there was no idea of Indian nation was prevalent. It was the product of colonial regime. Under colonialism, we started perceiving that we are nation. So it is certainly a product of colonialism. So from where the idea of Indian nation and nationalism emerged. So obviously the kind of history and kind of writing which colonial authors had done. There were three kinds of broad schools which wrote on Indian culture, Indian kind of history, Indian kind of, we can say, heritage. One was obviously utilitarian. Those officials who professed the idea of utility. And you all have been knowing about this school. Bentham has given this idea, a political philosophy, on which this whole kind of regime of colonialism was rested. So it's colonial kind of, we can say, officials who were taking the idea of utilitarianism to write about India. There were people, Christian missionaries, who want to proselytize, and they were writing about Indian culture, Indian tradition, Indian society. And the third group was Indologists. These Indologists were certainly having respect for Indian tradition. You might be knowing about Elphinstone was having some kind of respect for Indian tradition. William Jones, Colebrook, Max Muller, these were people who had some kind of respect for the ancient past of India. So these kinds of traditions started writing about Indian history, Indian culture, Indian society. So the idea of nation emerged as a response to their right. You have to understand the idea as India has been cultural oneness was prevailing in ancient literature. For example, there was certain kind of notions from Kanyakumari to Kashmir. There is a one nation, but that is a cultural trope. It could not be understood as oneness, the idea of oneness. These colonial scholars have theorized that there is India. They started writing about India as one India. And they have certainly given us a trope of narrative of India. So what was that? We can take example of James Mill. We will take the example of James Mill. James Mill classified Indian history in three periods. The first period was Hindu past. The second period was Muslim past. And third was British. It was a religious kind of classification of Indian history. So all history of ancient India, which was having several contradictions, were seen as one Hindu past. Muslim has several kinds of, we can say, rulers, several kinds of regime prevailed, several kinds of ideas prevailed, but as seen as Muslim past. It was judged on the criteria of utilitarianism, that particularly the Asian despotism, the idea of Asian despotism was coined. And on that, the Hindu past was criticized as the most decadent, the most savage past. And relatively, Muslim past was given some marks. They were seen as being the forward, but still decadent, savage, and backward. The only coming of British has been seen as the governance, which is somehow is civil, somehow is democratic, somehow is giving space to people. So this is a scheme within which the history is classified. Second, you have to understand that there is a thirst of critique on Hindu religion. We find that if you take the first volume of James Mill was writing about the conquest of British rule. This whole narrative stops abruptly, and James Mill starts writing about Hindu religion, Hindu way of thinking, Hindu way of thinking, Hindu manners. It's abruptly comes as so you have to understand that the Hindu Vedic tradition even is criticized even if it is criticized, is became a central kind of trope of conceiving India. That is, Vedic Brahmin tradition is centralized as the idea of India. The same could be seen in the writings of Indologists. Indologists have offered praise for the ancient tradition because they have this idea that in Vedas they were discovering their separated brother. They found the great kind of achievements of Vedas had been contributed by the Aryan people, and they felt like the severed brother, the separated brother, and they have in certain way has gone equalizing of Vedic tradition and Vedic literature. What exactly they did? They have largely enlightenment agenda. In enlightenment, I will speak loudly.
Sorry to bother you.
I will speak loudly. So they have the idea that monotheism is a principle of progress. So they have seen monotheism in Upanishad. So they started praising Upanishad as the most sublime kind of philosophy. So these kinds of praise offered by the Indologists, they started praising the various ideas. For example, in Vedas you will find there was some kind of rationalism, and the early rationalism is praised by these people. So you take example of William Jones, Maxwell and others, you will find some kind of, you can say, praise is seen. And it is obviously this whole kind of idea of self is always generated with other. So West have a counter kind of point of idea of East, where the East in certain way produces West and West produces East. So these kinds of interaction which was going on. So they have seen ancient past as a past which can give them some cues to alter the kinds of, you can say, relativities of their modern East. So they were looking at ancient past as a euthanasia to sort out the problem of the modern East. So this was a certain kind of way they were looking at the Indian tradition, and they have praised. In certain way they were writing a version where all kinds of, you can say, Indian ancient attributes were praised. What was that? And if you take the example that what was that achievement? If you take the Vedas as achievement, Upanishads as achievement, if you take literature as achievement, if you take scientific discoveries as achievement, then you will find each and every kind of achievement is attributed to Brahmin scholars. You take scientific kind of discoveries, then Bhaskaracharya, Aryabhatta, you will be going to eulogizing, evoking the tradition of the Vedic past, where you will find the Brahmin kind of dominance and Brahmin kind of hegemony is integral to the conception of narrative of these Western scholars. Despite some are criticizing Hindu religion, some are criticizing Hindu past, some are criticizing Indian kind of tradition, and some are praising it. There was a certain kind of conflict. All the colonial scholars in certain way are having a common kind of way of portraying India, and which is being understood in an Edward Said kind of position. There's Orientalism. So I won't go to Orientalist kind of premises, but I will cite 2-3 things. One, they have seen Hindu past as a monolithic Hindu past, and you know that it wasn't a monolithic Hindu past. Secondly, they have put Vedic Brahmin tradition as a central tradition to India. There is other times, but what India is, the core crux of India is nothing but the Vedic Brahmin tradition. The third thing, that in Hindu past, or their conception of Hindu past, or their conception of ancient India, there kinds of, we can say, resistances which took place based on varna, based on caste, based on gender. These all kinds of resistance were clubbed into monolithic understanding of Buddhism. So Buddhism, Jainism as a contradiction was not seen in their conception of India. They have portrayed it as a monolithic Hindu past. So this particular kind of narrative is strongly entrenched in Western scholars. So this particularly Western Orientalist conception of India, Indian history, Indian kind of religion, Indian culture, Indian consciousness, Indian manners, all that is as India. So you will find that Vedic Brahmanism is privileged, Brahmin hegemony is privileged, and caste and varna and patriarchal order is privileged. The conception of the Western scholarship. Similarly, you have to understand the early educated middle class, particularly the Western educated, English educated middle class, had a certain kind of paradox. They were the descendant of Vedic Brahmin and the self as being Indian. They are attached to the Vedic Brahmin kind of tradition. So obviously they want to continue. They want to somehow protect the Vedic Brahmin core crux of Indian identity. Secondly, they knew that things have gone wrong, and so there should be reforms. So we find the paradox was clear. At one hand, they want to continue the tradition, and on the other hand, they want reforms. So it is a reform which came forward was tradition and modernity, tradition and reform, where they somehow linked tradition to reforms. So while carrying any kind of reforms, tradition will be looked. So we find that if they are arguing about the reforms, particularly the voting marriage, they will be invoking the Dharma Shastra, they will be invoking Veda, they will be invoking several kinds of texts. See, in ancient past there was no presence of voting marriage. So let us argue for this. So this particular kind of trajectory prevailed. One. Second, you have to understand that their response was to colonialism. So colonialism has set a certain kind of agenda. For example, the colonial scholars criticize Indians as being indolent, as being lazy, as being not having intelligence or less intelligent. They criticize Indian male as effeminate. So you have to understand the response of these English educated elites emerged as Indians. Take the effeminate Bengali, which British projected, British wrote about Bengalis as effeminate Bengalis, and take example of Maharashtra scholars, English educated scholars. They are responding to the colonial kind of statements, colonial kinds of the demeaning statements, and you will find the first, for example, I will cite for you, the first kind of statement you can see in 1851. It was the great Ramoshi has written article in OCS, Orient Spectator, where he is arguing the women's reform. And while arguing women's reform, he was taking a stance as the Indian or protagonist of Indian nation. You have to understand this whole idea of India comes as a response. So if you take Dada Pandurang, if you take Vishnushastri Ambedkar, Rajaram Mohan Roy, all those scholars, the early scholars who preached reforms, were responding to colonial kind of knowledge as Indians. So the idea of India is very much there in their writing. So what exactly was doing? As the colonial scholars have castigated Hindus, they have castigated Hindus as Indians. So the response was Hindus. the word nation and Hindu are nothing but identical. Sometimes the Hindu comes, sometimes nation comes. So the idea of nation, which appears in 1841, you will find, is as equal to or identical to Hindus. Muslims is not included in the idea of nation. Dado Pandurang, while writing, while advocating women's reform, was responding to colonial scholarship and was making an argument, yes, we are Indians and we are Hindus. Hindu and nation is one and the same. It is not Modi who is doing it. It was a long past in 1850 when you will find the first reformers who preached widow marriages were arguing these things. And what is the proof then? That why Indian, can say, women's situation deteriorated? Then the stigma is attached to the foreign invasion. So you find in his writing the causality that why the status of Indian women was lowered. It is basically because of the foreign invasion. This foreign invasion has brought. So you will find the idea of other. So idea of other includes Muslim as other. Hindu as the core self-idea. So these processes you definitely can make up that these processes were taking place in 1851. And you will find that is what exactly was happening. The most advanced, the most higher brand social reform, you know, other Maharashtra, rationalists, nationalists, while arguing about Indianness, made a statement, Mool Ayatwa no Santa, without losing the core identity of Ayatwa, we should undertake reforms. The Ayatwa became the core idea of being Indian. That was the kind of articulation was taking place. I will extract it short. Largely you understand that this was the idea shaped under the reformist scholars, reformist intellectuals. Those we all have some kind of, we can say, conception. They have put the modernist agenda in India. These people who have unfolded modernist agenda to us were the first thinkers to conceptualize nation, and in the idea of nation, the other was absolutely the great intelligence. The other was absolutely the invaders in forms of Muslims, in forms of Kurds, and in forms of colonial rulers. The core Vedic Brahmin tradition was, we can say, privileged to be the central tradition of India. So we will find these kinds of ideas were there in those scholars who are educated. Obviously, in India, it is from Maharashtra, it is from Bengal, the culture nationalism emerged. You know, in India, Maharashtra, Vishnushastri Chiplunkar, and in Bengal, and one should read about it, what they are doing. Interesting. Now, we have to understand the earlier reformers were having some kind of apology about caste. The caste is hurdling nation making. So it is not allowing oneness. So we have to fight against caste because it is not allowing oneness. So we find these ideas prevailing in writings of Rajaram Mohan Roy. But Vishnushastri Chiplunkar equates caste pride with religious pride with national pride. And you have to understand that the BJP MLA who spoke that those who doesn't have right for caste and he abused them. So these ideas are there in the writings of Vishnushastri Chiplunkar is blatantly saying that we are proud of our caste. We are proud of our religion. We are proud of our Indianness. So, caste, patriarchy, region, Indianness, all are interconnected, all are subsumed into one. So there is the kind of apology which was there in reformist agenda was gone. So they blatantly supported caste, they blatantly supported patriarchy. You will find in writing. They blatantly rejected reforms. He said, Hindu dharmaची नाडी ठणठणीत आहे. Hindu dharma, nothing wrong has taken place in Hindu religions, and nothing has to be changed. So, a very strong kind of nationalist was putting this idea, and it was largely based. If nationalists are criticizing Western ideas, we will find he is profusely quoting Indologists. He has written an article, Vedarth Yatna, and in his Vedarth Yatna, he gives the references of all Indological scholars who have praised Indian Hindu past to defend and to certainly refute the reformist argument. To refute the reformist argument, he was invoking this Indological tradition which praised Indians and in particular Hindu past. So they are looking at it. You have to understand, this was a cultural nationalism, which you know that it was taken ahead by here. And you have to understand, Bengal and Maharashtra set a ground of nationalism, where not only Vedic Brahminic tradition, but the gods and goddesses became the icon of nation. So you all the time praise Kiran, who has started Ganesh Utsav. And you might be aware that Kali Utsav in Bengal, both were the events of nationalistic approach. So these kinds of events were seen as national rallying. So now they are putting the icons, and the icons were Hindu god and goddesses as the prime icons of Indianness. This is India. You might be having the idea of composite nationalism. Nonetheless, what is nation then? Nation is about Hindu gods. What nation is? So Hindu gods become a very integral part of idea of India. And that you have to understand, even in some kind of novels I've seen, NRI writes about her own consciousness about India, what he remembers. He remembers sentence. If at all anybody asks what is India and what is the idea of India, you can say, lives in his mind. He says that yes, temples. India is, people can say, land of temples. But temple comes in as the icons of Indianness. You have to understand these old Indian processes, which they galvanize, they make the religion as the force to which people can rally. You have to understand India, the community cannot be done. The community, because of caste, there is no broad community. The community is nothing but jatras, assemblies, gatherings. And therefore you will find this jatra trope was used to advocate nationalism. It is the jatra type, Ganesh Utsav is jatra, Kali Utsav is jatra. So jatra was used and deployed to garner the rally of the nationalism. So to understand these all processes are taking place, this is cultural nationalism. The other kind of nationalism which became the dominant nationalism in India was of Rangade. You know Rangade has in certain way theorized about Indian nation. He has written in this book called Rise of Chiplunkar and other writing. His composite nationalism, he was advocate of composite nationalism. Nonetheless, despite being composite, the idea of India rested on Vedic Brahmin tradition. For example, he wrote about Buddhism, and he said that Buddhism is a movement of agnosticism. What he argued? Buddhism is a movement of agnosticism. And later on he argues that national mind cannot rest on agnosticism. You can make it. So what exactly he is saying? This the religious resurgence has to be used and deployed. That was his statement. So although he was preaching composite nationalism, where syncretism is a principle, but syncretism is on the prerequisite of Vedic Brahmin tradition. This Vedic Brahmin tradition will be the main tradition, and the others will be subsidiary secondary. Islam, Christianity, Sikhism would be secondary, and the core kind of tradition would be the Vedic Brahmin tradition. So, his particular composite nationalism later on became nationalism of Congress, which later on was theorized by Gandhi. Gandhi became the thinker and icon of Indian nationalism, composite nationalism. Still known Gandhi, and this is the lineage of Gandhi, the lineage of patriarchal, the lineage of those social reformers who wanted to create India as a composite nationalism. What was their kind of take two task? What was their take two back then? Well, they knew that caste is harder, and they admitted, they confessed that caste is harder in this country. Nonetheless, they were not at all thinking caste aggression. They want to end caste. What they did, for example, take a look at what Lukadin said, caste is okay. Caste is okay. What is bad? The pride attached to caste is bad. Caste is still okay, fine. Everybody can have caste, everybody can live in caste, everybody can marry in caste, everybody can have its own kind of habitus of caste. What is bad? If anybody is having caste consciousness, caste pride, Jati Abhiman Nasawa. Now, this is a trope which is used by composite nationalism. Composite nationalism has given emphasis to unity by ignoring caste, ignoring exploitation, ignoring oppression, ignoring every aspect. And they say that privacy is there. And now let us come together. Come together. Don't dissolve your differences of caste. Come together. The idea of togetherness became the grounding force of the nationalists like Gandhi and the others. And largely we find that the early Brahmins, they had passion to fight against caste. For example, the Brahmos Mundari was founded to terminate caste. That was an interesting kind of experiment in Maharashtra. Happened only in Maharashtra. They all this organization to end caste. The only kind of first organization which emerged in India by taking object to 18 caste of Brahmins. And at that time they were taking water or taking tea from one mug. All the members would be, you can say, taking the ushta can be done. They were eating bread, or so this ritual was somehow transcending caste, somehow demolishing caste. But when the list of members was made public, the whole experiment it's a whole kind of demolition. So we have to understand this whole kind of trajectory. After that, the issue of caste never came to the position of the nationalist kind of plan. It was the family, it was these reformers who conceived the idea of national governments. They were the at the forefront. These reformers who conceived the idea of Congress took a principle that the Congress won't dabble in social issues. Our aim is political aim, and we will give primacy to political reforms, not social reforms. If all we take the primacy to social reforms, the oneness cannot happen, and to keep oneness in intellectual class, we should not keep the social issues on the agenda of Congress. So we find, therefore, the Mahadeo was carrying the experiment that whenever there was a Congress gathering, Congress adhivesion, Congress conference, they used to social conference. The same mandap, the same kind of hall was used by a social conference to discuss the idea of social conference. But in 1895, Tilak threatened, if at all you will undertake the social conference in the same mandap, we will burn down. So from 1895, they severed the relations with social conference. Social conference, own kind of trajectory, and Congress own kind of trajectory. So to understand this, the primacy of political reform debate, and while giving primacy to political reforms, the issue of caste was ignored and was seen as idle, but you have to target. The idea is fight. If you are picking the idea of caste, you are anti-national because you are not giving primacy to oneness nation. So the idea of oneness. So these were the processes. And now to understand what was the grounding force. Why in India we are facing serious kinds of problems when we counter nationalism. Ambedkar in Caste India argued that Brahmanism is a cultural system which provides unity to Indian society. You have to understand, yes, as a caste we are different, but as a system, there is unity. As a system, there is unity. Brahmin will be pure, Dalit will be impure. So there is system. And this system of caste is governed by a culture system, ideological system called Brahmin. So Brahminism, in certain kind of capacity, becomes a default force of. You have to understand this whole position. The Brahminism became default kind of ground of unity. So whenever you will find that when unity is in hope, Brahminism will be coming as ideology which will somehow be there. So in that sense, this particular kind of change was taking place. And you will find, for example, I will hope Radhakrishnan argued that Brahmins has created unity in the group of peoples, those who are mastered up, those who are backward, those who are savage, and put them together and taken them to the path of civility. And so this is organization of caste become certainly a very sublime act of Brahmins to put the Indian masses together. That is the argument of Radhakrishnan. Radhakrishnan praises the contribution of Brahmins in uniting all different kind of groups to oneness through caste. So we have to understand the privileging as a Brahminism as the core crux of your being. When you conceive yourself as Indian Hindu, Brahminism becomes a trope of oneness. And obviously, that becomes a certain kind of default ideology of man. So that, if you understand that, then we take up the arguments of Mahatma. crushing this whole idea, the whole idea of mind. So you have to understand, you might have, Phule was criticizing Aryanism. They are bad. They are invaders. They are queer. They are funny. They were human. So Phule has put Indian history in we can't accept it, but in the paradigm of race, paradigm of Arya Anarya concept. But by putting Arya Anarya conflict, he delegitimizes Vedic Brahminic traditions. Vedic Brahminic tradition as a non-sacred tradition, and he counterposes it that there is indigenous tradition and Buddhist tradition, which is coming from the ancient past, which was republicanism, which was democratic, which that time equality, freedom prevailed, liberty prevailed. That was kind of way he was demolishing the conception of Vedic Brahminic. Secondly, you have to understand the idea of golden age was given by British scholars, and we all are having some kind of a reiterating the idea of golden age. Some might put the idea of golden age in very period, some might put the idea of golden age in Uttar period, some might put the idea of golden age in Bharati Sampradaya or the Bhakti movement. You can have your own kind of Ambedkar, you can go back to Indian history as being the golden ages. You will find Phule has demolished all these kinds of golden ages. Even Bhakti. Phule criticized Bhakti. And in certain way, any ground, a very Brahminic ground, as being the ground of making this, is unacceptable to Mahatma. We have not accepted that as the ground. Secondly, what he does, he uses history in a different way, and one has to understand that we never do this. Some scholars are deciding Phule's history as not being useful. Sabita Kaviraj has heroized about Indian history as having a fuzziness. Fuzziness means that some kind of mythology, some kind of history. If that is blended together, it is understood as fuzzy kind of. So some scholars have decided Indian kind of understanding as fuzzy history, but I somehow have difference of opinion about this. But Phule's project was writing history of Sudan. And as you know, that if you write, if you have to write history, you need sources. And all sources, there are sources written, particularly in ancient India, were written by Brahmins. Sanskrit kinds of, you can say, sources, privileged. And if at all you are writing history of medieval periods, the sources written by the kings and sardars, they are privileged. So you can't write history of women, you can't write history of Shudra by taking the sources which are written by the hegemonic groups. So what can you do? The Phule somehow dwells on Biko. Biko has propounded that there is alternative ways of writing. He says mythology can be used to write history. Even today, we see that Marxist historians or even historians like historians like Rubila Thakur, they have used this as sources. And fascinating way they have interpreted the mythologies and somehow interpreted certain past. So you understand history can be written through mythology. What should that? Because in mythology, the actors which are coming in mythology, are class representatives. What they are? They are class representatives. Mahatma Phule took it as a class representative. For them, Devs are the representative of Aryans, Danus are the representative of Arayas, and Phule in certain way written a black and white history of ancient past. He dwelled on Dashavatara, Dashavatara kind of thing, and has wrote this. Secondly, you have to understand, he has used anthropological method. Although he was not that advanced, he has used the tradition to write. He argues that in Maharashtra and even in other parts of India, the event of Dasara, when the men go for Simolanam, they dance in the boundary of village, and that is Simolanam. The warrior people has to go out, the king has to go out. And when they come back in Brahmin houses, there is a ritual performed. A body made of rice. It's covered with pears. There is a certain ritual is made. And in non-Brahmin houses, there is a tradition of Pida Karo Bali Sarati. Bali should come back. So the Bali, the conception of Bali in Brahmin houses, the conception of Bali in non-Brahmin. So it suggests the conceptual history of Brahmins and non-Brahmins. So he has used the anthropology as a ground to write. He has used the etymology. We are using etymology as writing history. Phule's use was wrong. Nonetheless, he has used etymology as writing history. I am not arguing that Phulean history is correct, actually correct. But the principle of Phulean history has to be accepted. Phule says, history of India is nothing but history of caste. And that absolutely in each and every part of India, you find that it was caste development. So the caste was a system of exploitation, and so the caste mechanism and caste resistance, both they are part of it. So this statement about caste model as principle of Indian history. Secondly, what he does, he picks out the heretic tradition as seen as heritage. He somehow picks out the caste resistance taking place in ancient past. He talks about Buddha, he talks about Charvaka, he talks about several others kind of traditions which fought us. Till Tukaram, he was invoking these traditions of ultimate caste and patriarchy as a traditions different than a Brahmin tradition, Aryan tradition. So he somehow grounds his own kind of oneness. He gives counter kind of conception, counterpoint of oneness is Anarya. Is largely, and this Anarya is inclusive Anarya. The Arya is exclusive Arya, which excludes Muslims, which excludes non-Brahmins, which excludes Dalits. But this particular notion of Anarya as oneness is largely the inclusive notion. So you have to understand this whole kind of dichotomy where today is considered the idea of nation. What was Ambedkar? Ambedkar very criticized the oneness of Indian past. He said, our history is erroneous. The way history is written in India is wrongfully done. He says the dynastic history, the emphasis on political history is wrong. You are not unfolding the socio-cultural aspect of political history. So he argues that one should give emphasis to socio-economic history. And there he argues that the past, particularly the Hindu past, so-called Hindu past, was not one. And he says there was a Brahminic past, there was with this caste and there was no caste. So in a certain way, he rewrites the history of India. He argues as similar kind of fashion as Phule goes out. Phule said there was no oneness in India. Caste doesn't allow you to be one. And therefore, he defined the nation as ekmailo. Unified people. And ekmailo. Unified people. And he says, until you are not demolishing, ending caste, nation won't come. So, termination of caste system becomes prerequisite of nation. Ambedkar argues a similar line. He says, we are ushered out to different types of caste until we are not demolishing caste, creating caste. The idea of nation, national feeling, national mindset. So both are shading a plan that yes, there was not an idea of nation prevailed, and there is still no idea of nation there. If you want the idea to be executed, the only way you can do that is both were the conclusion that India can become nation. It's not nation. The idea that India was nation and is nation and will be nation, as we understood that Phule said India was not nation, it's not nation, and we have to make India nation. And without these projects of nation, we can't go for this. So, in this structure, in this whole logic, you have to understand one point, and that is what that Phule Ambedkar was criticizing the culture, the hegemonic culture, the hegemonic history, the hegemonic tradition, which is grounded as the basis of the to make things clear to you, Mahatma has given two categories of nationalism sprang from this. One kind of territory which comes from France and England was based on values. You might be knowing about the French Revolution was the time when nationalism emerged. It was French Revolution. The feudal kind of rules in Europe came together to demolish French Revolution, and they attacked on French. The reaction of nationalism was to save revolution. So he argues that yes, there are values around this nation was garnered. The idea is like one people who support you. So this is a tradition of nationalism in England and France. He argues that in Italy and Germany, the idea of nation rested on culture. The idea of oneness rested on race. The idea of oneness rested on past, glorious past. Italians, Roman past. Germans, the pure blood. So we find that these ideas were guiding forces of Indian nation. You know, Savarkar was writing a book on 1857 Europe. At the same time, he was writing a book on Mazzini. Mazzini was invoked, and cultural nationalism always was based on the model of the Italy and Germany. And we find even the RSS builds on their own nationalism. It is not their own way of making. It comes from German and Italian nationalism around the same ideologies and So you have to understand this particular kind of nationalism was fought on the grounds of culture critique. Means you can have dispute with Phule and Ambedkar about their some kind of you definitely can. But the thrust of their writing has to be understood. It was demolishing this hegemonic conception, hegemonic narrative of information. That was the point. I will come to second point. There are other points also, but I won't cover that. I will come to second point. That is very central to our becoming of nation. And that is colonialism as a system of exploitation. You all know that colonialism has made Indians poor. It was actually escaped with colonialism. There are three phases of colonialism. One phase was capitalist captain. The second phase was treated capitalism. And the third phase was investment. Okay. So all these three phases, colonial phases, has exploited Indians. So you know that the industries were declining. You know that the peasantry, the Adivasis were impoverished. You know that the artisans lost their opportunities. And there was large scales of starvation, remains, and the impact of British Raj was really so obviously there was resistance. You have to understand the first resistance was not came from the elites, educated elites who coined the idea of India. It was the tribals. Tribals across India fought against British. So we will see that take examples of Sattal, take example of Poles, take example of Ramoshi, take example of Hills, take example of some Mahadeo Koli. In all parts of India, the tribals took the banner of resistance. They were the first fought against colonial. The second kind of group which came forward was the peasantry. And the people who were displaced, they were starving. So we will find that grain riots took place. In 1830, the grain riot. People attacked the grain shops and took grain early. And these types of grain riots was everywhere in India. So we find that there was peasant rebellions in Maharashtra in 1875, even in 1857. Even in 1857, we will find that the peasantry sided against basically to resist colonial exploitation. So colonial exploitation was always resisted by the downtrodden of the nonetheless. We never knew that they are the first kind of, you can say, people who put their nationalism. It is now understood as proto-nationalism. Fine. Because they were having loyalty to their land. The idea of region was small. The idea of loyalty to community was small. So we don't accept it as an idea of nation. Nonetheless, but all you have to understand, this was the first resistance against colonial oppression. Colonial exploitation. So if you want to see the first kind of uprising in making us nation was in this kind of same way. What was that rebellions? Phule argued that these rebellions are backward. Yes, indeed. What they wanted, they never had the idea of progression. They were backward looking. They wanted the earlier route. For example, what they wanted earlier system of earlier kind of situations where tribals are allowed to have their autonomy. Their autonomy is facilitated by colonial rule. The externally system contractors came to the Adivasi area. They were made sharecroppers. Their autonomy was deeply demolished. So they were rising. They were rising this, but they were backward. They were not having the idea as where India should go. The idea where India should go. And that was certainly given by educated people. We find Darabai in Maharashtra. There are several others. For example, Maharashtra was first. So there was Master Tarkar, who at that time in 1852 wrote about the exploitation, the idea of rape. So these kinds of scholars who somehow had understood colonialism as system. The greatness of Darabai Naoroji, the greatness of Master Tarkar, the greatness of others was that they have understood the system of colonial exploitation and oppression. That the peasantry, that is important. So that is important. But what they put the contradictions between the colonialism and India. So the interests of Indians and the interests of colonialism are apart. So they certainly put this around this paradigm, the colonialism and India. Nonetheless, what are the Indian interests? How you can articulate Indian interests, and you will find the idea what is Indian interest, economic interest. The Indian economic interest is defined in terms of capitalist zamindars. The interests of capitalists and zamindars and money lenders got precedence, got privileged position in this whole kind of articulation of Indian interest. They talked about peasantry, they talked about tribals. You know that in indigo farmers there was a large scale kind of, you can say, mobilization took place in Bengal around 1860. You have to understand, they were talking about peasantry, but the interest which privileged as economic interest, they privileged the zamindars and traders. For example, the first kind of Congress never went in Indian industries to organize labors. They made a point that Indian industries could make success on the basis of cheap labor. So the forte of Indian industrialist and Indian capitalist is what? Is cheap labor. So the cheap labor should be the condition of Indian capitalism, and it should persist. They continue to support Indian industries on the cost of the laborers. So that was their position. That was their agenda. And even, for example, Ramoshi was the great man. The peasantry was losing their control over land. You know that because of money making, they lost their ownership of land, and it started going in the hands of elite money lenders. Ramoshi argues this process is nothing but development. He says that the land would go to the people who can invest in that land and thus can magnify the production. So in that sense, this particular kind of economic-based process where the peasantry is losing their land is welcome. It has to be welcome. See the similar position which is taken by Ramoshi, and the similar position is taken by Phule. The immediate exploiters were codes. The immediate exploiters were moneylenders. Immediate exploiters. The colonialism got enormous wealth through these people, these moneylending, the zamindars, these companies. They augmented their wealth. British augmented wealth based on this, and therefore the peasantry, the untouchables, all these Adivasis were put to a condition of least consumption. So they were living in such a conditions. If you read Mahatma Phule's classic, you will find pictures, you can say, portrayal of this. So, what was Phule was arguing? Phule was arguing that these independents are held to peasantry in every kind of predicament, every kind of distress. Moneylenders are helping the peasantry. If you remove this moneylending class, then this cushion to peasantry will be demolished and peasantry gets reduced to more kind of distress. And what was the annoying factor? He said the colonialism is the only expert. Colonialism is exploiting you because they are increasing taxes. So, in that sense, the argument is very clear. With this. So, there were several arguments. I won't go into that. But what Phule did? Many times it is understood, the scholars always assume that Phule was pro-British. Phule was pro-British. If you read Phule's writing, you won't see any kind of proof in it. Phule criticizes British colonial exploitation. Character very exploitative. Besides, he argues that how in 30 years by March, there was always settlements coming in 30 years duration. Means British took a stance that they will be increasing revenues by taking kind of stocks after 30 years. So Phule was making the argument that how the British rule is exploitative. You just take Ramoshi and Mahatma Koli. Similar argument. If Ramoshi is criticizing British exploitation, in the same way Ambedkar was doing, there is no difference. You just keep one kind of piece of writing and the other piece of writing. How these British officials are exploited. How the British revenue policy is exploited, how trade was exploited. In all aspects, what is the impact of British rule is disastrous, and he criticizes British exploitative system in very terse and very abusive words. So, in certain way, Phule both where in certain kind of group with economic nationalism, and they criticize colonial exploitation operation. For example, take Ambedkar's writing on crucial finances, take Ambedkar's writings on problem of rupee, take Ambedkar's writing on small holdings bill, and other kind of writing. Take every writing of Ambedkar, and Ambedkar is criticizing colonialism, and particularly economic aspect of colonialism. And you know that the problem of rupee is nothing but a nationalistic kind of argument. Ambedkar's PhD was in states. His guide said that, can you change this argument? Ambedkar said, no, I won't change. So Ambedkar persisted that argument, and they knew, Ambedkar both strongly criticized the colonialist problem. Nonetheless, you have to understand that colonialism or liberalism as a system doesn't operate in vacuum. Any system doesn't operate in that way. Today's and Ambedkar's understanding of imperialism is in certain way advanced, better than of Marxism. Ambedkar was criticizing Marxists that the imperial exploitation is really principal contradiction. I am not denying that. But you have to understand that imperialism is using caste and patriarchy for surplus appropriation. The surplus is appropriated through caste patriarchy, and if surplus is appropriated through caste patriarchy and imperialism is integral to this surplus appropriation through caste patriarchy, then how can you just single out imperialism and attack on it? You have to, you can say, see it as an integrated system. Because it helped this whole system of this caste helped British to aggrandizing their own kind of share of India. So the exploitation could be augmented through caste. So in that sense, Ambedkar was criticizing and was making this point that if at all the principal contradiction is colonialism against colonialism, then we should not ignore the contradiction with caste-class. Lenin has put an idea, and you know that Lenin said that in colonial countries, the principal contradiction is against colonialism. So, even ignore class contradiction, go with nationalist kind of stuff. So, the Communist Party of India, Marxist Party of India, all the time was the nationalist struggle. Although several other people were having some kind of differences, nonetheless they continued the Lenin line. Ambedkar was arguing against Lenin line and was saying that no, the caste-class contradiction is also important contradiction and we should not ignore, we should subsume the caste-class contradiction and patriarchal contradiction with imperialism. We should somehow explain the whole kind of structure, explain the system, and then we can say our struggle. At that time, he argued, he invited, he made appeal to them that we Marxists and Ambedkar and the whole kind of anti-caste should give an alternative to the Congress. According to him, Congress supported the interest of high caste, high class, and patriarchy. So, this was a certain kind of economic conflict. Then you find that the primacy of the emancipation is top. Ambedkar argues that what is freedom? What is freedom? Freedom is freedom of people of that country. What is freedom? If nationalism is about freedom, what we fought for freedom. If the one objective of nationalism or nationalist kind of agenda project was to get freedom, then what is the meaning of freedom? Is it emancipation from the foreign yoke? He says we have to understand that freedom is nothing but the freedom of the people living in that country. So who are living in that country? Tribals are living in this country. Peasants are living in this country. Working class is living in this country. So whose freedom? So their freedom. So Ambedkar in certain way was expanding the idea of this. So largely this whole idea where Ambedkar was, you should read Ambedkar's book on what Gandhi and Congress were. And Ambedkar is categorically arguing the interest of Congress. How Congress is somehow upholding the interest of capitalist class and money-lenders. Categorically, particularly you have to understand Ambedkar has launched a struggle, economic struggle at forward against poverty, and his struggle was sabotaged by Congress. Congress supported votes they argued that in the interest of low caste, in the interest of women, protection of working class should be given preference over the national interest. What you are calling national interest, where you are subordinating the interest of lower classes. Whenever you are articulating national interest, you will be subordinating the interest of the lower classes. Even it happens for any caste movement, the caste interest of men will be privileged and the interest of women will be subordinated. So the subordination process, marginalization process is on, and therefore Ambedkar says that no, this subordination is not acceptable. We should have an equal kind of interest of the common people. Third kind of, you can say, sphere where we should somehow see is the sphere of society. So, what was the conception of Gandhi? What was the conception of Gandhi? What was the conception of Nehru? All of this largely has not taken caste as the issue in politics. And you know that in 1920s, the issue came into Congress. Ambedkar argued that Congress is not honest about and the issue of compatibility was taken up by Congress. But what was the history of Congress? They have established the they established several other leagues. What they did was the cause of contextuals. And Ambedkar gives the negative aspects of Congress, which has not done. The important kind of argument which we can find in Ambedkar's Unleashing the Caste. In Unleashing the Caste, Ambedkar begins with the debate over privacy to social or partnership. We know that this particular kind of debate was or continued to take national debate, where the Congress has given emphasis on political issues. So Ambedkar makes this point that why the side of social reform was difficult. And Ambedkar certainly takes point. One, that in our notion of social reform, it was not the reforms that they were given humanistic. It was family reforms. The issue of caste was not taken by our reform movement. Third is that there is a defeat of political line, because of the political line. And he cites the example of the separate electorates and says that separate electorates have emerged. And now we have to tackle the social problems coming in the path of nationalism. So it is not that the line in reference to social reforms is very, and the line which is giving preference to social reforms is very. You have to see that all you have to turn you should get intellectual and social cultural kind of things. He argues that in each and every part of the world, the cultural, intellectual revolution facilitate any kind of economic and political. So if you are favoring political reforms or political revolution won't come without intellectual and cultural revolution. So you give the example of in Maharashtra, the Varkari Sampradaya movement has given a political platform to the It is Sikhism which has given the political platform. So in all parts of the world, we cite several examples and says that ultimately, if you want to carry out a revolution, political revolution, or economic, certainly you should bring in the cultural change. So, important Ambedkar is taking this particular revolution. Secondly, the issue of caste was twisted in the discourse of man. Gandhi made a certain kind of trickery. Gandhi made Varna its good. Untouchables is bad. In earlier phase, Gandhi argued caste is good, untouchables is bad. And the whole kind of understanding of nationalism invoked Varna as egalitarian society and started speaking in terms of Varna. The idea of reform, which is accepted by Gandhi, was totally related to Harijan, and particularly giving some kind of equality, not equality, some kind of space to the untouchables through their own kind of subordination, their own kind of subjection. So this was Gandhian kind of thing. Gandhi wrote in the medieval economy of caste as an ideal of nation. You have to understand that Gandhi has written a text, Hindu Swaraj. You might be aware about this text, Hindu Swaraj. Hindu Swaraj in certain way addressed the imagination of downtrodden people. Because downtrodden were seen colonialism as oppressive group. They were against doctors. They were against police. Police are exploitative. The advocates are exploitative. The particularly white apron, you can say, wearing doctors are in certain way oppressive. So there was certain kind of call for the downtrodden imagination. Gandhi was writing about against industrialism. Gandhi was writing against these colonial kinds of symbolism, and therefore Gandhi's Hindu Swaraj was accepted as a nationalistic understanding of Indian kind of vision. And you know that even Gandhi said, even later he was like, was asked, do you still accept the writing of Hindu Swaraj? He says, yes, only I still continue is Hindu Swaraj. So you have to understand that this idea, the social nationalism, rested on Varna idea, which was a movement of fiction. The second idea is Gram Rajya, Gram Swarajya idea, and third is denial to modernity, denial to industrialism, denial to all kinds of changes which are taking place to modernity. So Gandhi, in certain sense, was articulating a scheme as a nation, and therefore I will ask you to read Ambedkar's text, what Gandhi and Congress have done. Ambedkar argues what is Varna, and this whole idealization of Varna is baseless, useless. This is a historical figment. That's it. In no historical time, Varna persisted as an ideal institution. Never been. Who will, can say, organize society on Varna basis? Gandhi argued, don't occur in Maharashtra according to one's quality, according to one's value. Who will do that? So Ambedkar argued that even caste system is rested on Varna hierarchy. Very sociologically trend-setting. Ambedkar was arguing that Varna organizes caste. Even today, if at all there are multiple of castes, if they are situating themselves in a hierarchy, they will be situating in the hierarchy of Varna. Shudra, Atishudra. So Atishudra will be untouchables. Other castes will be in Shudra. Some will be in Varna of Vaishya. Some will be in Kshatriya. So even today, Varna system operates as a system of hierarchy. So it was not the ideal system. Ambedkar demolished the idea of Varna as an ideal. Secondly, Ambedkar says this is nothing but revivalism. Ram Swarajya is an idea which is nothing but a revivalism of medieval backward caste system. What you doing? What is Ram Swarajya? Each occupation performed by the laboring caste would be continued. Peasant would do its own kind of occupation, Mahad, Samar, Dhor, or other castes like Sonar, Sudan, they would continue their own kind of occupation, and that is understood as a utopia against modernism, against all kind of industry. Ambedkar criticized Gandhi's idea as a fads, irrational. And you have to understand, Gandhi was, even Jawaharlal Nehru has not openly criticized Gandhi. It was Ambedkar who was somehow demolishing Gandhian kind of ideology, which at that time became the grounding social ideology of nationalism. So this criticism certainly was making a very ground for nation. What Ambedkar was saying, that in India there is no possibility of being nation, because Kayastha will follow Kayastha leader, and if at all the leader or the man of that caste is corrupt, is illegal. Nonetheless, because there are caste loyalty, they will affiliate with that caste leader. And this is happening all over India. So it is somehow taking toll of our national consciousness. Caste is certainly is a hurdle in making Indian consciousness. So Ambedkar said there is a need. Those who are nationalists, Arya Samaj, he was talking to Arya Samaj in his speech and Vishnushastri Chiplunkar, he was talking to several people at the same time. So he was addressing to nationalists, Arya Samaj nationalists. His leader, you have to emulate us. So Ambedkar was strongly not happy with some kind of jugglery, which Gandhi was doing with the social view of India. And he was very clearly arguing that if at all you have to be a nation, then you have to emulate caste. Caste will come the last part, and that is what is the will. There was a certain kind of understanding of Ambedkar of the caste dynamics in India. Caste and patriarchy is always resisted in Indian. Not a single time has taken place where it was not resisted. All times caste was resisted. But the modality of caste resistance was vehicle of caste. People organized on basis of caste, and the Brahminism allowed it to a certain kind of structure, and which is understood as Varna upper mobility. You can understand that in medieval period, those Shudra, those tribal kings who became rulers, got the Kshatriya status. There were movements of Sonars, late Brahmins. There were several other castes who claimed the Vaishya status. So, with all, there is a certain kind of space given to castes to upward mobility. Then, by the act of upward mobility, you just come to surrender to the idea of Brahman. You become part of Brahman. So, by contesting, to perpetuate caste hierarchy, to perpetuate patriarchy. So, these kinds of contestation, these kinds of struggles won't sort out if you are all the time fighting, criticizing, struggling with the system. It won't, you can say, come out from the caste, come out from the patriarchy. So, there is a need for alternative. Without alternative ideas, without alternative project, you cannot continue the interactive politics. Without alternative, your interactive politics will be pointless. You will be, you can say, marching for a 3 years, and you will gradually attain or not attain. But that in certain sense will perpetuate caste, the system will perpetuate patriarchy, and won't in certain way help the grand project of Conversely. There, Ambedkar was arguing for. So there can be several ways we can interact and interface Ambedkar. But Ambedkar, in certain way, was articulating a broad plan of secondly, one has to understand that Phule Ambedkar teaches us that any kind of nationalism are nothing but figment of imagination. And these figment of imaginations are thrust on you just to hegemonize the masses, just to keep the order, keep the interest intact. So, any kind of nationalism should be taken to task of it. Without this one, you cannot deal with nationalism. The idea of nationalism are based on hypotheses, based on presumptions, and these presumptions and should be decided in the light of the interest of common people. Nationalism lies with common people. Nationalism lies with women who are from the non-profit classes and classes. So, with all your decides, thirdly, you have to understand the bigger point that if the logic of self, which Indian self is that logic, cultural logic, economic logic, is coercive, is oppressive, and that economic coercive logic and force, if at all it is not criticized, without it is not somehow countered, it in certain way it takes you in that way. And that is what exactly happened in 19th century, and which is repeating in our. For example, the ideas of nation and nationalism was shared by the reformists and cultural nationalists. Cultural nationalists took offensive stand, and they succeeded. Congress took a soft stand, and BJP took a hard line. If your grounding ideas are same, then any kind of aggressive stance has a chance to succeed. So if this logic is understood, then one has to see that this particular kind of movement, you should not fall prey to the idea of building nationalism, but we all should take up the idea of alternative nationalism, which is supported by Phule and Ambedkar. I will stop here and take this forward. Yes. Thank you.
session. So please feel free to raise questions, seek clarifications.
I need to ask about, you spoke about orientalist and also another school of Vishnushastri Chiplunkar, R.C. Dutta, they all talked about the self-sufficient village economics. He said that right from the time of Alexander, with the Mughals, LKGs, and like Shahs, all the ingredients, they could not touch the self-sufficient village economy. So only the British colonialism which disintegrated that. And that self-sufficient village economy was based on Mahadeo. So even about that, I think the left has not paid attention to the caste. They say that because of the caste-based division of labor, it allowed Indian and what Marx was Asiatic mode of production. So what are your views about that? The second question is about the Baba's concept of state socialism rather than the private interest. Thank you.
Asiatic mode of production, the idea of Asiatic mode of production had several ideas. One was self-sufficient economy. Second was that the land, particularly water, is governed by state. Third, that this was static. But it was not changing. Marx always perceived that the economy would change all the time. Because in India, economy was not changing, he has to theorize, he was forced to theorize Asian. This idea of Asian despotism is a conception which is denied, rejected by Indian society on various counts. Particularly, this self-sufficient economy model was not there as self-economy because each and every village cannot produce iron, nor that each and every village can produce the salt, nor each and every village can produce copper, nor each and every village can produce corn, nor each and every village can produce water. So we find that this whole kind of idea that last was self-sufficient economy was not true. The second thing one has to understand that is important, that there are three spheres of surplus of
In this whole
there were three spheres of surplus of and that is ignored by Marx. One sphere of surplus appropriation was state. You have to understand the state was collecting revenue of 20% of total property. This peasantry or artisans, the state was collecting the revenue up to 40%, up to in period past. So where this 40% go, and you will find there is a redistributive exchange. Means who will be appointed as globals, who will be appointed as priests, who will be appointed as dancers, who will be appointed as civil art, and you will find there is a redistributive network. To cite example, that largely the redistribution is to high classes. That means it's summing the Marathas or summing the castes. Thirdly, Bariyas, middle class, largely benefited because of the state exploit. State collected 40% of people and redistributed. The second aspect you have to understand, the redistribution method as Phule has defined is having religious institutions as sterilized. So I will cite the example of Lok points out that if a Brahmin performs prajna, he will be given 5 rupees. And if Maha goes for 8 goes is much kind of walking. Just double it. It goes to 50 kilometers or so. So if you walk 50 kilometers to give the messages of their people or some other kind of messages, they will be getting one message. So you have to understand that there exists another kind of sphere, the exchange, where the peasant, where the low caste, where even less and high caste got this. Peshwa were having 9 crores of income as state revenue. Bajirao Peshwa spent 1 crore of this income on Ramana, giving gifts, giving Vishnushastri. You can understand state. The second kind of sphere is sphere where the complete economy is the distributed economy, or in certain say village economy. Where you have to understand that all laboring caste, including Mahatma, Kamaldo, and all serving caste, artisan caste, used to offer labor to peasants. And presently, and these laborers combinedly work, and because of that, the grain of wheat stands in the field as a form of production. These kinds of castes were redistributed on this wheat. Ambedkar says that the principle of graded equality enters in economic sphere where the high caste get best and most, and the low caste get least and worst. So what Mahal used to get, what Mang used to get, Matero and Gavan. Matere is the grains which are there in the harvesting pit. Gavan is the grains which are there in the sheep of cow or the goat. So in these forms, it was here. So this is the second kind of sphere. It was unequal, and you have to understand that 40% of surplus is already taken from peasantry by state. So from peasantry to the untouchables, they live in another kind of condition of least or dependence. Thirdly, you have to understand the third kind of sphere is open market, and that is important sphere where the products and labor of low caste, they never, even the products of peasant, they never had negotiating advantage. If a man goes to labor market, he cannot negotiate. If peasant comes to market by taking his agricultural facility, he can't have negotiating power. So you have to understand that these prices of open markets were decided by relationship class domination was. The advantage cultural capital of social capital of those castes which persist in this market. So this is not open market. If Dalit is offering labor, will be paid less. If peasant is paid higher, a woman is working in the field, paid less. A male is working, paid higher. So you have to understand still today, this caste patriarchal system of social relations are governing the exchange of market. So in these ways, you can understand that caste as an overall teaching was important. Why Ambedkar was fighting against caste is basically because of economic implications. And that economic implications were certainly came to cultural social systems. The cultural social system of caste is conditioned for exploitation. So you can't differentiate between the structure and superstructure. Superstructure, as you see, as relationship of domination subordination, comes to the economic kind of ground state relationship. So one has to understand that this complex thing, and therefore caste not as a system only difference that we see as economic, social, cultural system, which is certainly marginalizes employed on this, the lower class. There is a power kind of relation. I won't go into it, but this is a larger kind of position, and therefore Ambedkar was against this whole thing of self-sufficient demand. Even peasant is exploited, although they were the exploiter of the rents. So this is a graded kind of exploitation, which never allowed the exploited classes to come united and fight against their own kind of exploiters. Ambedkar recurrently is making this point that in India, people are not getting fight against the several kind of competitions of government. So these are the issues which one has to understand. Second point you made.
State socialism.
This point, I think you know that Ambedkar, and this is a real kind of predicament of democracy. One has to understand that there are several problems, there are several kinds of issues in our democracy. For example, one has to take it on theoretical thing. For example, when Congress was founded, Sir Ambedkar made a point, and that was a very valid point. And Sir Ambedkar has been separatist fine. You can see that. What he was making the point? He was making the point that in India, Hindus are in majority. If democracy would be a system of governance, then Hindus would come as a majority in power. So our place as Muslims are threatened. So when Congress has adopted democracy as a principle of governance, Sir Sayyid made a point that as Muslims, as minority, we don't have space in your democratic system where majority will be. So one has to understand it that. Similarly, the same way you have to understand that therefore Ambedkar, prior to making a constitution, writing a text, and the title of the text is States and Minorities. The vulnerable, the minorities like untouchables, the vulnerable minorities like vulnerable minorities like tribals, the vulnerable minorities as Muslims, vulnerable minorities of any kind of mixed minority. If at all in majority kind of sector of democracy are being left to their right will not be accepted. The majority is majority. It's huge majority. But at that time, I said that the majority is the worst. And now you have to handle this as the only way of making this movement of taking democracy is to state. If at all we would go for state socialism, only then we can survive it. This fragment of democracy has to be understood. And this fragment of democracy is very central to us. We are just and Islam comes to power. In Turkestan, Kemal Pasha's legacy has gone. In India, Modi has come to power. And this issue of minorities would be kept into its terms, into its state. And therefore, Ambedkar was in favor of making industries national. Ambedkar was in favor of taking land away from the king and making it as a cooperative agriculture. So Ambedkar was certainly was making a profound idea that all you have to sustain democracy, you should keep the agenda of it as central to Indian nation. Otherwise, we would face serious crisis and we had crisis. Ambedkar at that time when was adopted state that we are entering into this the era of contradictions and we have accepted political form of democracy and no social democracy. And it definitely would somehow make our democracy in danger. And we know that we are in danger because of this. So state socialism is a principle which Ambedkar thought that sort out the predicament of democracy.
How do you look at there are regional articulations that come in, like Maharashtra as a region, sub-regional, sub-national, so where do you locate and how do you locate those kinds of articulation
Two dialogues because they have to close. One, that if you read Rajwari, there are several articulations of Maharashtra. Andre has given an articulation of Maharashtra. Rajwari has given an articulation of Maharashtra. Apur has given an articulation of Maharashtra. So many others. I will go into detail. I will take example of Rajwari. As you know, Rajwari has given a very clear kind of perception of Maharashtra. What is Maharashtra? He says Maharashtra is equal to Hindu Dharma. So that plus दो ब्राह्मण प्रतिपादन plus स्वराज्य plus एकीकरण plus विलीन means I think Marathi get better. The other part people are not. Other part is very interesting. Other part is saying that the alien insurgent Hinduism is Maharashtra. Maharashtra Dharma is integral to Hinduism. So it can be understood as the agency, a kind of humanized agency to Maharashtra. Second, you have to understand that he makes a very clear kind of dharma. Phule dharma, jati dharma, all these dharma are integral to idea of Maharashtra. What is jati dharma? What is Phule dharma? Phule dharma is Jati dharma being structure of caste. So all these dharma, he gives a sequel of dharma. These are foregrounding principle of Maharashtra. In certain way, I already said the cultural nationalism in certain way takes pride in caste, takes pride in religion, takes pride in whatnot. And they make religion as the grounding kind of root of all these things. So, certainly, this technical.
Anantita,